Okay, we're going to start considering quantitative techniques in terms of the collection of primary data. Remember last time we looked at qualitative data. And here's just a brief summary of the types of quantitative data that we can collect. There are three broad categories: surveys, observation, and experiments. We touched on experiments already. And under surveys there's generally four categories: personal interviews, telephone interviews, mail surveys, and web-based surveys. So we're going to consider those in a little bit more detail. So yeah, really, if you're looking at the survey method, it's collected from the population, or not the population, but a sample of the population, with the goal of being able to draw conclusions about the whole of the population. So clearly, if you think about marketing research or any type of research, really you want to know what the people think. And normally it's not possible to go and do a survey of the whole population, which you will recall is known as a census. So normally what one tries to do is just take a sample, and then hopefully, if everything lines up, you'll be able to draw conclusions about that, about the population from the sample. So one can do it either by verbally or written, by way of written communication. It's generally contained in a questionnaire, and this is an aspect that students often get a little bit confused about, or maybe it's just a language issue. A questionnaire is not necessarily a form of survey. The survey method is usually contained in a questionnaire, which can be verbal or can be written. So just bear that in mind. Make sure that you, when you talk about a questionnaire, that you've got it clearly in your mind exactly what you're trying to do. But nevertheless, it's most common method of gathering primary marketing information, and so it is an important element of marketing research. It's got its limitations clearly, and you can have a look at those in the textbook. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but nevertheless one has to be aware of its limitations. Alright, let's talk about survey errors, which is obviously an important element of market research. We want to make sure that we limit the types of errors, and there are two types of survey errors really. That's a random sampling error, and that's where there is a difference between the sample and the population in terms of the results. So clearly, remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to survey a sample, so we can draw conclusions about the population. So if the results differ between the sample and the population, then that's what we refer to as a random sampling error. Systematic errors are errors which aren't related to sampling, and will occur if even the whole population is involved. It can relate to the actual data collection process or the actual design of the research. So the constraint, it's a constraint in terms of the design or actual implementation of the measurement instrument. And they can divide it into two broad categories, and that relates to the sample design error or the measurement error. So just to discuss that briefly, so if you design the research so that you are collecting from the wrong population, or perhaps the population doesn't understand your instrument, those can be either sample design errors or measurement errors. So just to kind of reiterate and make that clear, if you have the wrong population and you're surveying the wrong population, and you're hoping to draw conclusions about a different population. That is a sample design error. Whereas measurement errors is where your instrument is incorrect, or perhaps the people don't understand the questionnaire. Those would be measurement errors. So your instrument isn't collecting what it's supposed to be collecting. In terms of surveying, how do you go about collecting the data? Well, there are a number of ways of doing it. Personal interviews, obviously going from literally from door to door. Mall intercepts are typically where you typically go to the mall, not necessarily the mall, but you could be doing it in a university campus, in the dining room, and really stopping people and saying, please, can I interview you, or will you fill in a questionnaire? And then executive interviewing, which would be typically looking at managers and getting their perceptions about an organization or the consumer markets, using surveys once again. Different ways of doing telephone interviews. I mean, it doesn't really matter the format these days. It might have mattered a number of years back, but really interviewing is pretty much standard. Doesn't matter the type of application or device that you use. Mail surveys, as opposed to internet surveys, and I think I've discussed this before. Your mail surveys would be where questionnaires are emailed to respondents. I've got reservations whether that will really work anymore. I don't think people pay much attention to physical mail anymore. So it's very unlikely that someone is going to open a letter, fill it in, and then post it back to you. Internet surveys, as I've mentioned, are probably as challenging as mail surveys these days, given that we get so much mail from different sources. So I would suggest that you need some secondary way of persuading people to fill in your questionnaire. As I mentioned, when I did research, I phoned people first and requested them to fill in the questionnaire. Yeah, so it's important that you know each type of survey, its description, categories, advantages and disadvantages. So just looking at the categories of surveys, we've kind of dealt with all of these. So I'm not going to go through that again, but just we've touched on all of that. What we haven't touched on really, looking at the collection of primary data and taking us back to the beginning of the lecture, we haven't touched on your observations and your experiments. Now, I did allude to experiments right in the beginning, I think, of one of the first few chapters, and discussed how a colleague of mine used computer-aided applications to track people's eyeballs to see what they would look at, and that would be an example of an experiment. But it doesn't really form a core part of the course. So what we're going to have a look at is observations. Just consider that for a moment, because that can be quite an important element of collecting primary data, which doesn't necessarily fall within the context of surveys. So let's just have a look at the observation and try and understand what it is. So what it is really when you, an example would be if you were in say Pick and Pay, and you wanted to understand how people interacted with the shelves. So you would observe them and see where they walked in, which way they would go, and you wouldn't communicate with them, because obviously you wanted to understand as far as possible what they would do without realizing that they were being observed. So yeah, it's really direct observation, and you would gather data doing that, seeing the path that they followed perhaps, or looking at what they looked at first. If there was a whole lot of deodorants, where would they start looking? how would men differ from women in terms of behavior in front of the deodorant aisle. You could do it by human observers or using mechanical devices. It's obviously one can look at it anecdotally, but certainly it is scientific when it's formulated for a particular research purpose. It's planned systematically and recorded systematically and related to general propositions, rather than just sort of anecdotal evidence and saying, like, oh, that's interesting. If we say, well, for example, if we observe men, and this has been found out, observe men as opposed to women in terms of their behavior before deodorant aisle, men spend a lot less time than women do. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, that has been found, that has been researched and is an empirical finding. So one needs to make sure that it's valid and reliable. So that implies that you need some sort of systematic way of approaching this challenge. Okay, but the question is, and I mentioned to you right in the beginning of the course, what about informed consent? Just from an ethical perspective, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it didn't really matter pretty much what you did when it came to research. But these days, ethics are an important part of not only academic research, but also marketing research. And one of the clear principles or canons of ethical research is that people need to consent. So within that context, one has to question to what extent informed consent is still a viable option. Think about that one. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 8. As I said, we're not going to deal with experiments. It doesn't really form core part of this course. So thank you, and I'll chat to you